discussion. And to really table set, we have to go back a little bit more than a year ago. When President Biden first entered the White House, let's all remember that unemployment was at 6.4%, almost twice pre-pandemic levels. The US economy was fresh off a bruising year with GDP contracting 2.3%, and the recovery from the pandemic was at risk of stalling out. Let's fast forward to 16 months later, and we are in a vastly different place. Unemployment is back to pre-pandemic levels. Monthly job growth is keeping a pace with an average of 500,000 jobs added per month, and wages have grown, with the largest increases going to the lowest paid workers. These are the workers who suffered the most from stagnant wages for years, and so many of whom have been essential in keeping us all afloat during the pandemic. The economic assistance delivered in the rescue plan was vital in kick-starting this growth. The expansion of the child tax credit, for example, helped reduce child poverty 30%, while also bolstering household finances for working and middle-class families. Yet there's no doubt that people across the country are facing economic headwinds. Inflation has hit people at the gas pump, in the grocery store, or at home while they're paying their utility bills. The extraordinary efforts by this administration to right the dire economic straits of early last year have put Americans in a vastly better position than they otherwise would have been in. But we all recognize that much more needs to be done. Tackling inflation is the administration's #1 priority. And as the president has made clear, that involves enacting policies that can lower costs for households and families straight across the country. That's why this White House has proposed policies to address healthcare costs, childcare costs, energy costs, policies that can lay the groundwork for future growth and the long-term easing of inflation. Through their work on the American Rescue Plan and with shaping the White House's economic agenda, Cecilia and Jean have played critical roles in those ongoing efforts. As chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Dr. Rouse has been a key counsel to the president in navigating the economic recovery in the wake of the pandemic. She previously served as the dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and prior to that, served as a member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors from 2009 to 2011. Jean has led the White House's charge in implementing the American Rescue Plan. He previously served as the director of the National Economic Council, both for President Clinton and President Obama, and in between the two, worked as a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress. So Jean, this is coming back home of a sorts for you. Welcome back. And Cecilia, thank you so very much for joining us. I'm going to begin with you, Dr. Ross, give you an opportunity to just give us a sense of the big picture. You, of course, serve as the chief economic advisor for the president and therefore for the nation. How are you viewing the current economic moment? Where are we now? And where do you see us headed?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for inviting us here today. In many ways, I see the output and I think of the outlook for our economy and how we got here very similarly to the way that you just characterized it, which is if we go back to Inauguration Day, that was 17 months ago to the day, the pandemic still had a very strong grip on our economy. The recovery was uneven and fairly uncertain. And it was unclear how feasible it would be to deploy vaccines to reduce transmission and regain normality. And I want to underscore the efforts to address the pandemic as being very key to both where we've come through in terms of this recovery over the past year, but it's also critical to where we go from here because we are not done. This pandemic is wily, this virus is wily and continues to mutate, and we will be contending with it for some time going forward, and we need to have the resources to do so. And so today, this country looks very different. As you noted, much of that can be attributed to the American Rescue Plan. In addition to the support for households that you underscored and outlined, I think very much it underscored and underwrote the effective distribution of vaccines, therapeutics, masks, and tests, all of which allowed the economy to reopen and to rebound. So as of, if we go over 2021, real output grew by 5.5%. That was the fastest clip in any single year since 1984. Also, that year, unemployment fell at its quickest pace in a calendar year since recorded data began in 1948. The labor force participation rate of Americans aged 25 to 54, which we refer to as prime aged, grew faster in 2021 than in any year since 1979. Today, our economy is about 3% larger, even accounting for inflation, than it was just before the pandemic, and that's the fastest recovery in the G7. So this success was not given. It wasn't a given. It was rather, it's been our work over the past 17 months that have resulted in well-designed and well-administered policies that have provided the tailwind for long-term recovery. Okay, so that's a glass half full. You also talked about the challenges that we face. So I'm very cognizant of the fact that we've got headwinds. So, but we could have not really have emerged from one of the history's most extraordinary crises. And on this, I'm referring to the pandemic, not the war on Ukraine, although that is providing an additional really large challenge. But we really could not have emerged from the pandemic, which required the United States to power down, our $23 trillion economy, required the entire world to power down without having some challenges as we get back to normalcy. So one is clearly inflation. So there are multiple causes. There was money in pockets that people had to spend. There was strong demand for goods. We had supply chain constraints. And so including the pandemic's impact on labor supply. And now we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So if you take all of these factors together, that underscores the inflation. And so while we are facing high prices at the gas pump and in grocery aisles, it's important to imagine what would have happened without the support provided during the pandemic by the federal government. This goes back 2 years, starting with the CARES Act and with the support provided to financial markets with the Federal Reserve. So this counterfactual would not have been pretty. So Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics estimates that thanks to Congress's investments in CARES and the ARP, we likely avoided a double-dip recession in 2021. And that we likely avoided an unemployment rate that would be above 5% today. Moreover, as I think Jean will speak to, long-term unemployment rate was cut in half over 2021, which if we compare it to the Great Recession, it took around 4 years for long-term unemployment to fall that quickly. And so our success means that we have prevented the type of labor market recovery and kind of scarring that usually follows recessions. Okay, so where does this leave us? And I know that's a lot of what we want to talk about today. Well, this is a time of uncertainty, and I understand that. But it's really important to understand that the United States economy has resilience. So first, our labor market is robust, as unemployment is currently at 3.6%, and continuing unemployment claims are the lowest since 1969. Second, most household balance sheets are strong and can provide some cushion for rising prices. I understand rising prices are painful. I understand that, but because of the efforts over the past year, there is some cushion to adjust and respond to them. And third, American businesses are continuing to invest, and that's an important component of growth. In the face of current challenges, I take comfort in the fact that our economy we have the tailwinds to face the headwinds. So I will also just 2 more points. Because of this resilience, we face the current challenges from a much stronger position than most other countries that are peer countries in the world. And second, as I look forward to where we're going, I'm going to leave the guessing and the predicting to others. But what I want to emphasize is that here we are focused on builders. We are builders, and we are focused on building a strong, inclusive economy with policies that expand our economic capacity to generate higher growth that is more equally shared. So thank you.
Thank you so very much for that comprehensive response. Before I turn to Jean, I want to just probe a little bit with a follow-up on something that you touched, which is, of course, of consequence, which is the circumstances right now in the Ukraine. And I wonder if you might say a thing or two about how you think that impacts on some of the forecasts going forward. And I asked that question in full recognition that one of the things that we most admire about you, Dr. Rouse, is that you resist leaning into forecasting in a way that kind of surfaces over the proximate challenges that we have. But clearly the Ukraine is an issue here as we all work to lessen our dependence on petro-dictators. You can give us a sense of how you're viewing that impact would be useful.
Well, absolutely. Look, Russia's unprovoked invasion and war on Ukraine has disrupted energy markets, it has disrupted food markets. And so those are the two big challenges that it poses to the United States and to the world. So let's start with energy. So the United States is less dependent on Russian oil than many other countries around the world. But oil in particular, but other sources of energy are traded on a global market. And so as the Russian oil, we put sanctions on Russian, we didn't need to put sanctions on the Russian oil, but as we put sanctions on the Russian banks, et cetera, there have been many, as the oil markets have adjusted, we know that the price of oil has really skyrocketed, and it has had some consequences for the supply of oil in terms of our refinery capacity. And that is largely the reason why we've seen the spike in oil prices over the last 2 to 3 months. So that is a headwind that we see that we are certainly facing. I will say that the president is doing what he can to help alleviate those bottlenecks. He has partnered with other countries around the world to do historic releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. He has been urging our oil companies, which had, because of the pandemic, when we all stayed home and demand for oil dropped, they were not operating at capacity. He's been encouraging them to be operating at capacity, drilling in using those leases that they're not using to capacity to get a greater supply of oil on the market. And he is, investigating other ways to address those higher prices. Food is another area that we're very concerned about. The United States is a net exporter of agricultural products, but again, many of those prices are set on the global market. And so he's been working within our agricultural sector to provide ways to help farmers increase the number of crops with double insurance for double cropping, finding ways for them to lower costs in terms of fertilizers and make it more efficient for them to do so. And so, this is all the direct result of the war in Ukraine, which, where this is up to Putin. As you know, the United States and the president feel very strongly that democracy is at stake here. We are in lockstep and working in cooperation with our allies through NATO. And the president has said from the beginning that it's going to be costly for us to defend democracy in this way, but it is very important for our future and for the future of the kind of economic system and the kind of society that we value here in the United States.
Thank you so much. Well, Jean, as we like to say, this is not your first time at the rodeo. I had the privilege of working alongside you in the White House when we were all trying to figure out how we recover from the Great Recession. And I wonder, given the leadership role that you played then, what lessons from the recovery of the Great Recession, or do you believe this president and all of us need to apply, or currently applying now, to build a stronger, more sustainable economic recovery into the future? And give us your sense of the current landscape as Dr. Ross just did.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much. And thank you to you and Seth. And yeah, I'm proud that I was one of the first senior fellows in economic policy at Center for American Progress when it first started. But first thing I just want to say is, we understand the challenge we're facing. I mean, we're facing a historic issue in the global economy that, of course, is affecting us in the United States. It is the economic aftershocks of a global pandemic that led to really an unprecedented shutting down of the economy and then an unprecedented starting up. And of course, that has led to supply constraints. It's led to higher prices globally. Understand that the fact that people all over the world are dealing with it is, not necessarily of great comfort to an American family going through the gas pump or through the grocery lines. But there's also no question that these things have been exacerbated by events. Delta and Omicron certainly set back some of the adjustment in supply that one was hoping for. And just to put a fine point on what Cece mentioned, gas prices were at $3.31 on January 17th, the day Putin ordered troops to the border of Belarus and Ukraine. So when one says there's over $1 Putin tax on Americans, there's no question that is, provably the case. Now, let me try to answer your question about the conditions and the lessons learned, perhaps in the same frame. I think when you look at the American Rescue Plan, you have to see it as having really two fundamental goals. One is to actually ensure that we, as you said, we didn't get stuck in a dark winter or a double dip recession, that we not only could recover with strength, which we certainly did. I mean, we didn't just recover faster. We were back to our GDP levels by the end of the second quarter, while most of our G7 peers didn't make it till 2 quarters later. So we certainly recovered faster. But I think one of the main goals, too, was to bring everyone along, to have a recovery that was equitable and reduced, as Cece said, as Dr. Rouse said, the scarring that takes place. And then secondly, and again, this goes to lessons learned, our inability in the Obama White House to get Republican House of Representatives to give us a second recovery plan or second stimulus was harmful to the recovery. It did not lead to the type of equitable or non-scarring recovery that we wanted. And so I know President Biden started out with one, let's have a recovery, let's jumpstart this recovery that brings everyone along. And number two, let's ensure that that we can have a durable and equitable longer term recovery, one that has a bit of a cushion against these unknowns that happen, like the unknown of a type of war that one might have thought in Europe was in the history books, but then things like Omicron and Delta. So I just want to say, when I was NEC director for President Obama, we did not resist. We embraced when people said it wasn't good enough. We called for more because we knew long-term employment was stayed at very high levels, as it did after the 1982 deep recession. We knew that youth unemployment was had been at very high levels, sometimes over 15, 16, 17% after the Great Recession and after the deep recession in 1982. And if we had more time, you could go through the hard evidence on the scarring. Scarring meaning long-term unemployment often has a worse impact on people's emotional health and long-term earnings than even a death of a spouse or cancer. Youth unemployment kept people, set people back economically for their careers. It leads to less marriages, more divorces, less children, all sorts of long-term things. And these were things that President Biden was very aware of. And so look at the difference. Youth unemployment, instead of staying around 17% for several years, has had a record drop. It had the largest drop calendar-wise, and is now below any point it was in 2019. What a huge difference. What a lesson learned. Long-term unemployment, as Cece said, stayed very high, now has had the largest drop ever in a single year. Let's talk about Black unemployment, which did not return to pre-Great Recession levels for 6 years. Now it was over 15% in the years after 1982 in that deep recession. Now we've had not only a record calendar year drop, it is below pre-pandemic levels. Hispanic unemployment saw a record drop, the largest calendar year drop, and now is at 4.1%. Below pre-pandemic levels. The other things that scar people, leaving long-term harm, foreclosures actually reached a record low. The thing I worked so much on was eviction prevention. We read article after article that there was going to be a tsunami of evictions, the pent-up demand from the moratorium. What happened? Because of the American Rescue Plan, because of the emergency rental assistance now going to 5.3 million, not only did you not have a tsunami, we actually had a recovery where evictions were below historic averages. So when you talk about this recovery, again, as Cece said, not just looking backwards, but looking forwards, it has not only met our values, but it has brought more people in, it's brought more people along. And I do think that this leads to a greater degree of participation and a greater degree of resilience. I think there's an important point Cece said, you could go on. Credit card delinquencies were at record lows in 2021. Household debt service is low. JP Morgan Chase's median weekly checking accounts are strong. The New York Fed Equifax data on credit card balances is strong. All of these things suggest, I think, something that is underappreciated as people look at the current economy, which is there is a strong degree of resilience in addition to the equity and values that are in a recovery plan that is designed to reduce scarring and bring everyone along. And I'm going to stop right now, but I'd love to follow up on, when we have time, or in a follow-up, if you'd like more, on what the lessons have been about ensuring that this is an enduring recovery. Because one of the things we dealt with in the Obama White House is unexpected things happen. Remember, gas prices went up due to the Arab Spring. We had a supply chain due to the Fukushima meltdown. We had the debt limit scare, and we saw GDP growth, and we had no funds in there to keep things strong. Now we have a plan that is ensuring that even though we've dealt with Omicron, Delta, and now an unexpected war that has disrupted and roiled energy markets, overall, not just the balance sheets of American families and businesses, but states and local governments who contracted deeply and hurt our recovery for several years after the Great Recession are in relatively strong places. I've heard people say, oh, maybe you've overlearned some of the lessons from the Great Recession. I really don't believe that. I think there's been a lot of wise things done. This movie is still going. And I think in the end, people are going to realize that having a recovery that both led to this strong jumpstart that brought everyone along and yet had the durability to help us deal with the after effects of learning loss and people who left the workforce and mental illness challenges from pandemic will be wise. And I think that will be the ultimate lesson.
Well, that's all exactly right, Gene. And I think it's utterly ridiculous when people suggest that we overlearned the lessons from the Great Recession, when we had an incredibly slow recovery from the Great Recession. But more important than that, it's evident when you look at what occurred in the early stages of COVID, that there are whole swaths of the economic community of Americans, working poor, who were exceedingly vulnerable because we didn't anticipate their needs and center their needs. You write eloquently about the need for us to center dignity as a metric in economic outcomes, and it's clear that has not been the case in the past. So I'm going to come back to you, Gene. I'm going to ask you, since you tried to tee it up for yourself, I'm going to ask you what we can do to build resilience, but more specifically for the working poor. You just cited some of the numbers for Black unemployment, Hispanic unemployment, and there are some things that this administration has done that I think has lifted up scaffolding for the future for the working poor. I'm going to ask you to lean into those. Now, Cecilia, even though you are a labor economist, I'm going to ask you some questions about the supply chain, if I can, and I'm asking them almost with a bit of bewilderment. I just find it to be absolutely extraordinary that the richest, most powerful nation in the history of humanity could find itself with the kind of challenges that we had in supply side infrastructure that were exposed once the global economy reopened. Once we started to hit we hope it's truly the endemic stage of this pandemic. We know that because this administration robustly managed to sustain aggregate demand, you were able to drive down unemployment, but we have this elevated demand for durable goods and an inability to produce and transport them quickly enough. I've heard you speak about some of the things that we learned about the inefficiencies that we have in ports and the inability to manage data in a coordinated fashion through that infrastructure. I wonder if you could just touch on some of that now, give our audience a sense of what you learned, what you discovered in this moment, and how some of the decisions that have been made through the infrastructure bill, as one example, what decisions you've made to take that on and to make sure that that's no longer a challenge into the future, not just in this inflationary moment, but beyond that as we try to anticipate future crisis.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one thing that we have to understand is that supply chain, which became a household word during the pandemic, is really about all the different steps that are involved from the beginning of like raw materials until you have a product that is on somebody's shelf and somebody is buying it. You can also have supply chains in service sectors where people are doing things. You know, get your hair cut, you need the shampoo, and someone's got to cut your hair. But the reality is, over the last several decades, as we have opened up, and so we've become more global, firms have found it to be less expensive to maybe outsource. So outsourcing can be both domestic, but instead of trying to do everything in-house, so Ford making the cars, making the screws, making every component and then putting it together, they've discovered, hey, it's better if I buy the screws from someone else and then I do just the final assembly or whatever it might be. So there's that. So there's local and domestic outsourcing. And then there's the global transporting and going across borders and going across the world. And so, and especially with automation, where firms can, have a better sense of what's happening and keeping track of what's happening overseas or in different places, they have just completely outsourced, and the supply chains have become much more complicated. We actually devoted an entire chapter of the economic report of the president to this. And there are a couple of figures that are really illustrative of just how complicated supply chains have become. Manufacturers have a big incentive to improve their supply chains. After all, that's going to affect their bottom line. But one of the things that we have learned through this pandemic is that there are some real fragilities in how firms have constructed them. Part of that is going back to this idea that what firms don't, companies don't want to maintain huge inventories. So they have something called just-in-time production. So I'm not going to keep 2 years worth of screws on hand to make my car. You can tell I make a very simple car. It's made of screws and nothing else. But you just have enough screws to make the cars you need to make for the next month, et cetera. So it means that if there's a breakdown in the transport of the screws, then you may not have enough on hand to weather until your supplier of screws can get you more supply. But before I go to some of the lessons that we've learned, I do want to dispel one issue, which is that actually our ports, the administration helped tremendously in helping them to achieve better efficiency. But actually the throughput on our ports was higher than it was pre-pandemic. The issue is that we were demanding so many more goods that when people went home and were at home, we were consuming far more goods than we were services, and all those goods needed to come from somewhere, whether it was abroad or across the street or down, across the country. Someone had to transport them, someone had to build them, someone had to ship it, and someone had to get it working through the supply chain. So our supply chains and our ports were working overtime. Now we have very inefficient ports, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will help us address that. And there are ways in which we were able to help improve the efficiency of the ports to deal with this increased demand. But it wasn't as though there was we were doing less than before. We were actually put excessive demands on the system. But what have we learned in the process of doing this? So one is that firms don't have a lot of visibility into their supply chains. So I may buy my screws from a broker who's actually working with some other suppliers, and I don't really understand who the original suppliers are. And so it means that I can't monitor the capability of the original suppliers very well to meet demand that I might anticipate is going to change, but I can't signal that to my supplier very well. And so we know that's kind of necessary if suppliers are going to be able to help firms adapt to changing situations. Two, what we did learn through this pandemic is that just-in-time production works when everything's working. It's a very efficient way to run an operation. But when there are these unexpected events, there's no redundancy. And so there's no capability, there's no flexibility. And so we had a pandemic, but the reality is even, for example, the Fukushima nuclear disaster that I think Jean alluded to. We know that with climate change, we are having far more large, billion weather events every year that are disrupting our supply chains. And so we know that firms, we don't want them to over adjust here because it's very inefficient to hold lots of inventory that can actually become obsolete before a firm is able to use it. But we do know that they need to be planning for these kinds of events and not just expect that with the snap of their fingers that their product will appear. And finally, we know that firms need to be more agile, which means that they need to have workers that are able to solve problems on the fly. So if one supplier is not able to provide something, can we quickly adapt and use another supplier's parts in order to continue to make our product? And so for this really involves firms investing in their workers and investing in production and processes that helps them become more agile. So largely, there are a lot of incentives for the private sector to handle these issues and to increase their visibility, to understand how much redundancy they need, and to improve their agility. But there is a role for the public sector as well in promoting supply chain resilience. One is by helping with information. The Department of Commerce, for example, discovered with semiconductors that the suppliers may not want to reveal everything to those who are buying their goods because they don't want to reveal too many secrets, et cetera. And so just even being an honest broker, information gatherer can help improve the market. And we know that this can be so important for us as a country for issues of national security, et cetera. Right now, we're dealing with the baby formula challenge. And that's obviously one that has a spillover. It's not just about the end users and the producers, having children whose very existence is dependent on this food, suggests that there is a role for government, not necessarily to take it over completely, but that it can help smooth things over. So, we've learned a lot through this pandemic. We do expect supply chains to improve. I guess before I conclude, I'll add one other component to supply chains, which is that when we are unloading ports, when we are driving stuff across the country, when we're unloading trucks, when we are making stuff, that involves people. And so labor is another component of the supply chain challenge. And when you have a pandemic that affects the health of people, which therefore affects their ability to go to work, that is also part of the supply chain challenge. The administration has been very involved in trying to improve the number of truckers as just one example. But this, again, I'm just going to go back to the importance of our COVID and pandemic strategy and readiness, that people need to remain healthy if we're going to be able to continue working and to continue keeping our economy going.
Thank you so much for that response, an incredibly thoughtful response. And thank you for clarifying and pushing back a bit on how I described the state of our ports before the pandemic. It's all really incredibly important to understand. Dr. Ross, I'm gonna turn to Jean now, but I'm gonna come back to you. I'm gonna preview my next question to you so that you're ready for it. I've really been inspired to hear you talk about aspects of our care economy as central to our infrastructure going forward. I'm going to want you to just give our audience a sense of how you and this president, this administration are thinking about the care economy as a critical bricks and mortar pillar of infrastructure in the U.S. And what that ought to mean for investments in the next several years. Jean, I gave you a sense of what I hoped you would lean into. I remember being in campaigns some years back, Jean, where it was impossible to use the P word, the poverty word, where everything was, we would talk broadly about middle-class Americans. I've really been impressed with how this president has been really clear about the needs of the working poor in America, that there is a working poor, that we've got to give workers a fair shot through the decisions that are made around collective bargaining, et cetera. I asked you before if you would just kind of lean a bit into some of the things that have been done by this administration to center the working poor in outcomes in ways that would build that durability into the future through future crisis and other recoveries. Give you a chance to speak to that now.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And, I'll start off by addressing sometimes what people occasionally say when we go through not just the very powerful numbers on how equitable this recovery has been, how much this is not one where you can say there's not been major drops for all parts of our society. But some people will say, well, but yes, higher prices, inflation can hit lower income families particularly hard. And, of course, that is a concern. That's why the president puts lowering prices and lowering inflation at the top of his agenda. But, I do want to state today, in March, the OECD headline inflation number was 8.8%. The core was around 6%. We just saw in the UK, there was 9% inflation and 6.2% in the core inflation. In other words, lower income families everywhere around the world are dealing with a bit of higher prices. In the United States, however, during 2021, you've seen, and Cece could probably talk more about this, you've seen that a lot of lower income folks have indeed, because of the tighter, stronger labor market and the Invest American Rescue Plan, been able to get raises, and many so that they are on net ahead, particularly when you count the other things in the American Rescue Plan that went along with them. So I think that's very important to understand. The global inflation is happening virtually everywhere. United States, we are in not only better position to withstand these challenges that almost every country is facing, but we've been able to have a more equitable recovery and put people in a stronger situation. Now, I could talk for 7 years, but let me just mention a few things in the American Rescue Plan that I do think are important lessons. And as I think you said, building infrastructure of things, and particularly helping the most hard-pressed kind of working poor and reducing poverty, increasing opportunity that were in there. One is, I actually want to mention state and local first, because I do think this is one of the most misunderstood programs. Sometimes the phone rings and somebody says, it's all flooding out, you're causing inflation. Then somebody says, oh my gosh, even though you're investing in salaries, of course, it all hasn't been spent in, the first month, so it must be slow. The reality is that, as we said, in the Great Recession, the contraction at the state and local government didn't just hurt growth and employment almost every month in the first few years of the recovery. It didn't just do that. It robbed them of the ability to deal with longer term effects of the Great Recession. I'm not talking about long-term permanent plans. I'm saying that we know after the Great Recession, we wish we'd had resources to help those communities that had major foreclosures. We wish we'd help some of those smaller suppliers who lost their businesses for no reason of their own, and they didn't have it. By having a state and local plan, by having a plan going to school districts, they have been able to actually make thoughtful plans to deal with what has come out of the pandemic that has often affected particularly low-income families, but also in thoughtful ways that are going to put them in a stronger position to deal with the next thing. So every day I'm talking to mayors who are putting together thoughtful plans because they can do it over 2 or 3 years. It's not spilling out in the inflationary way. It's also not sitting on the sidelines. They're putting together homelessness prevention, affordability, housing affordability programs, workforce programs, really thoughtful community interruption plans on violence. These are all things they're able to do that we were not able to do in the past. We didn't know at the beginning of the pandemic that there would be so much of the problem with learning loss, so much mental and emotional health issues. That's not an immediate, that's not a 6-month thing. You want a place to have a 2-year strategy. So I really want to say that the state and local, or having the funds to deal with 2 or 3 years of the impact, is smart and good. And it benefits, I think, the most hard pressed among us. Secondly, the child tax credit. Like a lot of people, probably, I can't mince words. I'm heartbroken that at this point we haven't extended what was done in the American Rescue Plan, and will not give up hope. But what did we show? We showed that we could deliver a monthly child tax credit. I can't say when I took this job, I knew we'd succeed there. But 4 months after, 61 million children received the tax credit. We never used to talk about monthly poverty, but suddenly with the help of Columbia University, we're talking about the drop in monthly child poverty. We're talking about people not having to go to predatory lending when they have a problem. We're talking about people actually being easier to go to work because they can fix their car or pay for a little childcare if something happens. That is something where maybe we haven't succeeded in extending, but we should not forget that we have established that infrastructure can exist. We finally, after 20 years with Democrat and Republican support, have a meaningful earned income tax credit of $1,500 for people who don't have children at home, older workers, younger workers. That is a big thing in here that could change. And then finally, if there was one place where you thought, the building a new infrastructure wasn't going to work, it was the emergency rental assistance. How can you have to ask the administration to start up a brand new program in the middle of the crisis, decentralized, 450 programs? This was poorly designed. Well, it was hard. And there were a million articles about how the funds wouldn't get out. But for the first time in the history of the United States, something you didn't see in the Great Society, something you didn't see in the New Deal, we have shown that we can help prevent the scarring, the heartbreak, the family pain that comes with avoidable evictions. 5.3 million. Instead of a tsunami, evictions are less than historical averages. Is it messy? Are there all sorts of problems? Are there all sorts of things that need to be done better next time? Absolutely. But we have shown something very historic when you talk about having a policy infrastructure that protects the dignity of families. Because I will tell you, as I worked on it, I can't think of much more heartbreaking than having to tell your kids you're getting booted out of your house just because you happen to have lost your job in the middle of a pandemic.
It's the worst moment possible. And Gene, you said that you could talk for 7 years, but I'll save you from that. But your passion is noted here. And on that score, as I turn to Dr. Rouse on the care economy as part of the infrastructure, I'm going to return back to you on this question of passion and narrative. We have a question from somebody who said, this is a remarkable story that Gene is telling. Why is it that it doesn't seem to be showing up in the polls? And how can we have a party, the Republicans, who 192 of them voted against what needed to happen to get emergency funding for baby formula in the country? And I'm going to come back to you on this question of narrative and the comparative. Dr. Rouse, I want to come back to you on the care economy. And as I do that, I'm going to take our first audience question, because I think it's going to give you a nice point of entry to give us a sense of what you mean by the care economy and how it's central to our infrastructure. The question is from David. He says, one of the biggest costs on families, including mine, is childcare. It keeps on getting more expensive. And during the pandemic, we didn't have childcare. What is President Biden doing about childcare costs? I think that's a great way to just speak more broadly about the issue of the care economy.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate the question, and it really does go to the heart of President Biden's economic policy. So President Biden is really focused on generating and promoting an economy that has sustainable growth that is widely shared. That sounds like it's a platitude, but if we want to break it down, we have to understand what will generate sustainable, robust growth. And so if you go back to Economics 101, the growth is, and things are produced when you have capital. So that's like our infrastructure, our physical infrastructure. You need labor because people have to do things. And you need innovation because you need new ideas, you need technology in order to make it all happen. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was passed last December is a key component to us. It's fixing our bridges and roads, making historic investments in broadband, which we know has become almost a necessity in our economy today. Getting the lead out of pipes, which goes to investing in our children. We need to do more of that. We could say not more about that as well. But it's also, we also know that that's incomplete, that there is the innovation bill that is sitting between the House and the Senate, which has got some research money, because we know basic science is so critical. Many people may not appreciate that, like, we are well, we're not gathered here today, but we're getting through this pandemic because of the record speed with which new vaccines were developed. It was the federal government that provided the funding for the basic science for those vaccines. The federal government underlies much innovation. So we know that that's important. So we've done the infrastructure. We need to be investing in our people too. So that's not just pre-K, which is part of what I'll talk about in terms of the care economy. It's higher K through 12. It's higher education. People need to be able to get the skills that they need in order to become productive adults and happy adults. But it also means that people need to be able to do what they would like to do. Now, many people have care responsibilities, and we know this is disproportionately women, but it's not just women. And it's taking care of children, it's taking care of our elders, it can be taking care of a disabled child or disabled loved one. And if I don't know that my loved one is well taken care of, I cannot go to work. And so in the United States, where the labor force participation rate of women back in the 80s and 90s, it really increased a lot. Back in the beginning 2000s, we led the world in labor force participation rate of women. We have now fallen behind our peers. And that's largely attributed to the fact that we do not support childcare in particular, but home care as well. We do not support women in particular. It's not only women, but it's disproportionately women. The ability to balance those responsibilities. And part of the challenge for many families is that our care economy is really, it's a tough economy that has many challenges. So you point to the fact that the childcare is very expensive. It's very expensive because it's labor intensive. We don't want our little babies to be in classrooms with 30 other babies. That's not going to work for them. We know that we need to have ratios of adults to children in order for our children to be happy and healthy and well taken care of. And so the cost of high quality childcare has increased faster than inflation over the past many years. And yet we do not help in this country families with those costs. At the same time, on the business side of our care economy, it barely makes sense for our childcare providers. Many of those providers are women. Many of them are women of color, sole proprietors. They're not making much money at all. And they can't, in order to have a price for that childcare that families can afford, they cannot afford to pay their workers very much money, which means that our care workers are among the lowest paid, especially given their qualifications in our economy. In fact, 1 in 7 childcare workers, 1 in 4 home care workers are living in households that are below the poverty line. That's compared to 1 in 16 households overall. And so we know, and yet we know from the low income families, they're using 35% of their income to pay for childcare. So we need to both help boost the wages for the workers so that the childcare providers can both attract more workers and attract better quality workers. And so those workers are making a living wage. But we also need to help families to make those purchases, because we know that if we invest in those kids, one of the things, economists don't agree on many things, but one of the facts that we do agree on is that investments in children are among the best investments we can make as a country. That $1 spent on a child, whether it's through the child care tax credit by reducing their likelihood of growing up poor, whether it's investing in high quality childcare, will pay for itself many times over. Part of the challenge in our political system is that it's not going to pay for itself next year. That baby has to grow into a teenager who's not getting into trouble, that teenager who's graduating from high school and not becoming pregnant, not getting involved in crime. That baby needs to become a productive adult who is an effective parent and is making a good wage, so isn't then on the government dole. And so those investments pay out over 10, 12, 20 years, but they do pay off. And so if we want to have a stronger economic growth, we know we need to be investing in our people, the workers today, so they can both balance their work and their family for those who choose to do so. This is not a forced march into the labor market, but so that we can have adequate labor supply. But it's win-win, because it also invests in our children, in particular with the childcare, so they grow into more productive workers and citizens later as well.
That is an exciting program, and that is well described. I'm going to take your sustainable growth that is widely shared and try to turn that into a bumper sticker somehow. Just want to note that It is a altogether different framework than the one that we had for decades, which was a rising tide lifts all boats, which actually didn't speak specifically to some of the challenges that that middle class families and working poor had in our economy. We have a question from a reporter that I want to cycle in here, and I'm going to add a question from a viewer that goes back to the point I want Gene to lift into on the contrast. The question from the reporter is one for both of you. It's from Market Watch Dow Jones reporter Victor Rakaitis, and forgive me, Victor, if I've mispronounced your last name at all. One top economist just told me that any president, Democrat or Republican, has an extremely limited range of steps that can be taken to address an inflationary shock like the one we're having, driven in large part by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The recent release from oil reserves is the most impactful administration move so far, but isn't going to have a significant impact on the medium or long term, according to this economist. To what extent do you agree with the view that there isn't that much that any administration can do? So that's the question from our Market Watch reporter. The question from the audience is from Naomi Savin. How much, if at all, did the rescue plan contribute to inflation? What is the most effective way to push back against Republicans' bad faith claims that inflation is a direct result of government spending and the rescue plan? So, the first is about whether or not our hands are tied, if there are some more impactful things that can be done by this administration in this moment. And the second goes, Gene, to this question of narrative. And my favorite saying from President Biden during the campaign, which was, "Don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative." So I'm going to let you get a crack at that. But then whichever one of you wants to get into the Market Watch question first, Dr. Rouse, Gene, I open it to both of you.
Gene, how about I start? You want to then
Sure.
follow up? Okay. Look, the question goes to a hardened, which is a fact, which is that the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate, and that is to both ensure price stability and full employment. And so first and foremost, the president and his entire administration respects the independence of the Fed and also understands that this is largely their mandate is to address inflation. So the president, it's so important that Congress has now confirmed the 4 nominees that the president put forward. Michael Barr, who's the 5th, had his hearing yesterday, and it's important that he get confirmed forthwith as well, so that the Federal Reserve is fully staffed and ready to take on this challenge. Chair Powell has said that they are focused on this, and we are, we support the policy changes that they're making in order to address inflation. That said, the president is doing what he can as well. So yes, there's the releases from the SPRO. He's also put in place some waivers for ethanol so that we can be using more corn oil. I guess it's corn oil anyway. And you're using the biofuels to release some of our reliance on fossil fuels, engaging with international partners. I mentioned at the top, looking for ways that we can ensure we've got more supply of oil. We've been working in terms of exporting more natural gas to be helping at least with our partners around the world. I will give you my view on the American Rescue Plan and what role that played in our current situation. Gene may have some follow-up. What I will say is this, which is that when this pandemic hit 2 years ago, the CARES Act was passed forthwith under the prior administration with Congress. There was another bill in December of 2020, and then we had the American Rescue Plan. Because we needed people to stay home and socially distant. We did not remember where we were. We did not have vaccines. If we did not have therapeutics, we did not understand what this virus was. And so we needed people to stay home. We powered down the economy. People still needed to eat. They still needed to pay rent. They still needed to be able to pay for their lives. And so Congress swung into action, as was completely appropriate, and supported the economy. That's what other countries did too. Meanwhile, we also had the Federal Reserve, which was supporting the financial markets, and that was a contributor as well. So all of that was in the service of helping our economy get through a very uncertain pandemic, which we are still learning how to live with in a way where we are healthy and could minimize the health effects of just going about our day. If you compare our inflation to other countries, you can see that other countries that also supported their economies are also dealing with historic levels of inflation. The UK just announced that they just had 9% inflation, which is the highest they've had in 40 years. Now, a lot of that was due to the war in Ukraine, which has only added fuel to this fire. But if you look around the world, countries are dealing with inflation because it is a byproduct, it is a consequence of having shut down these economies. Now we're trying to get back to normal. And yet we are still got a pandemic, China following a no COVID policy where they are shutting down parts of their economy and telling people to stay home as their way of managing COVID rather than following a more robust vaccination program is going to create, that creates supply chain challenges as well. They seem to be managing through it. It has not fully affected us yet, but if they continue to go down that path, it will generate challenges going forward. We are in a good position to withstand those kinds of challenges because of the resources that were provided through the federal government, through the Federal Reserve, through the American Rescue Plan. So all of that is in the mix. It's appropriate now. We've got a strong labor market. As we've said at the top, we come into this with a lot of resilience. It is appropriate for us to be addressing inflation because that is a problem for families, and we understand that. But the United States economy is resilient and is best positioned from many economies around the world to take on these challenges.
That is a heartening response and a good reminder to all of us that we are building from strength to strength. But even as we do that, Jean, there is the reality of our political system dominated by two parties and a set of choices that are being advanced by this president and leadership in Congress that's meeting a tremendous amount of resistance. And I think that our audience member who asked that question is right in surmising that there's a real gap between the extraordinary story that you and Dr. Rouse just laid out for us and how that story is being received in this inflationary moment, but also in this moment of historic levels of obstruction. I'm going to give you a chance to just talk about that as we close out this dynamic, this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm just going to add like one or 2 points on Cece's answer on the inflation, which is obviously this is a global. It was a global shutdown. It was a global startup. 8.8% inflation OECD, 9% in the UK. I do think that it is unfortunate that there is often, I think, a not particularly rigorous, notion that, but if somebody can say, well, they're more energy independent, so there's a little bit of a differential. That differential must be that, the American Rescue Plan or the rescue plans before that. And I don't really understand why people look at that differential when they look at Europe and then not look at differentials, other explanations for why we might be having challenges. For example, there's
and here we're not talking about Dr. Rouse's former thesis advisor, right?
Well, I'll just give a few very quick examples. If you want to know about differentials that could have us having a little more, in some places, core inflation, than some others, we are more car dependent. That's a global issue, but the supply chain issues in cars probably affect us 5 times more than those in Europe. We are, Cece said, there are parts of the economy, including like rental cars, where there was massive shutdown of supply, which might have seemed good at the moment, but can lead to higher prices or more supply chain issues on the upside. We had, after the Great Recession, a very, very slow decade for building new houses. We did, increasing housing supply. So there are many reasons and complicated issues. I think when you look at the American Rescue Plan overall, yes, there's different studies. There's, somebody pointed out the other day, there's one San Francisco Federal Reserve study that shows it's 0.3 of 1%, very negligible. Another one looks at all of the rescue plans and sees it significantly higher. But I think that when you look overall, this is a global inflation problem. It's a global supply issue. We each have different reasons when you look at our economy that it might be a bit higher. But the real distinction is that the U.S. has, through this strong American Rescue Plan, has put itself in a more durable, resilient, and I think equitable situation. And I think that is important. One news flash was today, the state unemployment numbers came out. I mean, think about this. 17 states today reached their lowest unemployment levels on record. I mean, they've been keeping this since 1976. But,
Yes.
40, 50 years, lowest ever. And I think that, this is my third White House. We're adults here. We know people pocket good news. And we also know, and not just, I don't want to feel negative about it. A person can see that the economy is strong. Maybe they have a couple of adult children who've gotten better jobs and wages, but they still go to that gas pump or the grocery store and we're frustrated. Yes. And I don't think we should be disparaging. I think we should understand that. But I do think we can do better in telling us that story. Now, look, some of it is because when they did the American Rescue Plan, they were trying to lift the economy, not figure out how to do a political narrative. President met with about 9 mayors the other day on kind of public safety investment for American Rescue Plan. And 2 of them said, I feel a little bad. I'm doing well politically because of the American Rescue Plan that you passed. I'm announcing popular things that are helping me. And I feel a little bad that you're not getting the same degree of credit when we wouldn't have had that. So, I think there can be more to, help people understand that many of the good things are happening there due to the American Rescue Plan. Cecilia was just talking about childcare. Do you know there's 150,000 childcare centers? That means about 300 per congressional district that received funds that probably are keeping them open during Omicron and after from the American Rescue Plan. So look, our goal was to help people's lives have a strong and durable recovery. Yes, it's a hard news cycle to often break through. It's often hard to explain to people that something going well that's not on your plate because it's going well was due to the American Rescue Plan. But I think that what we're talking about a little today is the type of thing I think you hear from the president, and more will say that this was an equitable recovery that brought everyone along, that we have historically low unemployment, strong growth, that everybody's lifted up, and that is relevant to your calculations looking forward, that you shouldn't see that all as a quote too hot economy, but also to look at some of these strength of different groups, strength, lack of contraction in state and local, household balance strength, and say this also provides some optimism that we have a degree of resilience in this economy, even as the Fed understandably brings up interest rates to bring down inflation.
That's well expressed, Gene. I'm gonna, Dr. Rouse, you're our leader on these issues. I'm gonna give you an opportunity to close out this session. Gene just used the word optimism. I'm struck by your impressive optimism through all of the headwinds that we have faced over the course of the last year and a half. And I want to give you an opportunity to kind of give us an affirmative sense of direction here.
Well, look, there's no question we have been through a really, really challenging 2 years. It's been challenging personally, economically, socially, on every dimension of our lives was upended. On the economic side, we have recovered over the past year. We've recovered. There are headwinds. Do I want to say optimist? Am I optimistic? There are a lot of challenges that we face. But what I do know is that at this moment, the U.S. economy has tailwinds to help withstand some of the challenges that we know lie ahead. And I do remain optimistic that they will carry us quite far. I really do. I hope for a swift, complete conclusion to the war in Ukraine. And I have confidence in the Federal Reserve to be able to navigate us as they manage their dual mandate. But it's been a tough 2 years where I don't have a great crystal ball, but I do know that we face these challenges from a position of strength.
Well, thank you so much for that last word, but also thank you for your indefatigable leadership. Both of you are extraordinary public servants, and we don't have an opportunity to express enough appreciation for that. So thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I hope that you found it to be as dynamic as I did. We'll see you very soon. Thank you, Dr. Ross. Thank you, Jean.
And pleasure.
You guys were awesome. Thank you. Learned so much.